Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 27th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as I mentioned last week, I am traveling right now with the SGU, the other podcast I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. We are visiting Sydney, Australia, the North Island, kind of all over of New Zealand, and then Christchurch on the South Island, and making appearances at conferences in both Sydney and Christchurch. So I'm recording this in advance, and I'm not going to give a shout out to the patrons this week because I don't know if my list will be up to date, but we will continue that once I am back at my computer. So I say we just get into it this week. I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Valerie Fridland. She is a professor of linguistics in the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno. She also writes a language blog on Psychology Today called Language in the Wild, and did a great courses series. So for those of you who love the great courses, you can look her up there. She also previously wrote a wonderful book called Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good in Bad English. But we're going to talk today about her newest book, Why We Talk Funny, the Real Story Behind Our Accents. This is a really fun one. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Valerie Fridland. Well, Valerie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course, I'm so excited to be here and chat with you.
So we're going to be talking about your work and, of course, your new book, Why We Talk Funny, the real story behind our accents. I'm so excited to have this conversation. I am obsessed with accents. I love them. I find them fascinating. I'm also really obsessed with just like regional colloquialisms and all the different ways that individuals who share a similar language still have subcultures within it. So, but first, before we get into the book itself, I want to talk a little bit about you, about your scholarship. So you're a professor of linguistics. Is linguistics usually in an English department?
It varies. Linguistics is usually in whatever department we feel most safe that will survive the budget cuts, I think is
Uh-huh.
the way to say it. So typically, sort of in traditional linguistics departments, they've been separate departments. But in the
Mm,
last 20 or so years, they often go on the chopping block because they tend to be pretty small departments. So a lot of linguists have found refuge in English departments. So it is not uncommon for there to be a separate program in linguistics in English departments, but it's not necessarily the standard either.
gotcha. And so, really, probably it's important to drill down on what linguistics actually is. How is it different than what most people think of when they think of English or English class?
I think that's a great question because most people think of a number of different things when they hear the word linguist. And
Mhm.
it's typically not either the same thing as an English professor or an English teacher, nor as sort of the common folk understanding of what a linguist is or
Mm,
means. So, first, just to discriminate between sort of the traditional grammarian English teacher and the linguist that might happen to be an English department. We're really more the social science version of someone who studies language. So we're actually interested in the principles, both articulatory and cognitive, that drive our ability to speak as
mm.
human beings. We're not really interested in any kind of prescriptive rules, so the social rules that get attached over time to the way that we're supposed to write English, and then often that leaps off the page to the way we're supposed to speak. So the type of experience you have in English class where you're learning about nouns, verbs, and, this person, place, thing kind of thing. There certainly is some linguistics in that because the categories that we call nouns are linguistically real to us. Babies recognize nouns first before other things. So those do have some linguistic legitimacy. But the idea that they're a person, place, and thing, for example, is kind of a description rather than
Mhm.
an actual rule of how those distribute, or the rules like don't end a sentence with a preposition, those kinds of things. Those are not real rules in terms of cognitive rules for language. Those are social rules that arose in the 18th century. So that's the kind of thing that you get in English class. What you would get if you take a linguistics course in a college, which is usually the first time you experience it, is also different than the layman conception of linguist, which is
Mm-hmm.
really someone who speaks a lot of languages.
Mm.
I speak really one, and that sometimes badly, which is English. But I know a lot about the structure of other languages. So though I really probably can't order a beer in most of them or do anything useful when traveling there, I can tell you about sort of their relationship to English, the kinds of structures they tend to have, how they differ, where they're similar, what kinds of principles drive all human language, how our brain perceives language, what are the sounds that you're more likely to be able to hear versus others that aren't, what are most common sounds across languages. Those are the kinds of things that linguists like me, which are called theoretical linguists, study. And then
Mm.
to even drill down a little more, I'm what's called a sociolinguist, which is a tongue twister to basically say someone who studies the linguistics of social life. So, how are the groups that we identify with, the places we grow up, the class we belong to, the nations that we, pledge allegiance to? How are those things influential on the way that we will sound now and in the future? And those are the kinds of things I study. Most of the questions people have about language are really in the realm of sociolinguistics.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like the psychology, sociology, and cognitive science of language.
Absolutely. It's very closely aligned with psychology. So, a lot of linguistics stems from both linguistic anthropology, but also social psychology. So I'd say it's really a melding of sociology, social psychology, and also some anthropology. But then some linguists do a lot more cognitive psychology work as well. So it's,
Mm-hmm.
kind of an overlapping field.
I love it. All right. Well, we'll see if my if my doctorate in psychology is at all helpful for
I
this
think it will be.
conversation. I don't know. I'm pretty clinical, so I'm like on a one very extreme end of psychology, but maybe we will see. So, what made you want to sit down and write this book? Is it your first, or no? It's not. You've actually written another big book before, like literally, dude.
Yes,
Wow.
I wrote a book on all the speech habits we love to hate, which was like literally dude, as you can see from the title, what it might be about. And then this was really the book that was closest to the type of work I do in my research and also
Mm,
the experience I had growing up, because I grew up in the South, which a lot of people probably can't hear from my voice, but sometimes people will pick up a little trick or two that I have that's Southern. But I also had parents that were not from the United States. They were both native French speakers. And so growing up
mm.
in the South at the time I was growing up, I'm not going to admit how long ago it was, but it was a while with non-native parents was certainly an experience. And it made me aware at a very young age the power of accent. And, even though I had no idea at, 8, I wanted to be a linguist. I probably was thinking more like astronaut or doctor, something more standard. It did really interest me and fascinate me, the power that the way that I spoke, the way that my parents spoke, the way that I heard my friends speak had over the way that we reacted to each other. And so in college, when I took a linguistics class, all of a sudden it was like the curtain was pulled back on why and how. And that really drove my interest in both pursuing linguistics as a field and then finally unpacking that for non-linguist audiences, because there are a lot of me's in this world that have
Mhm.
that experience but didn't go on to get a doctorate in linguistics, that really wonder why their accents make them stand out, or why they think of other people in the ways they do with their accents, or even maybe believe they have no accent at all. And part of that is
Yeah.
because we really have a dearth of linguistic information. And so that kind of drove this book. I wanted to unpack it for general
Ugh.
audiences.
I love that so much because you're right. I loved it when you said there's a lot of me's. Everybody out there has their own kind of origin and then the culture or the pressures that they had as they were growing up. Some people were in one place most of their lives, other people traveled quite often. My own little anecdote that I have to share, having also grown up in the South, and people telling me all the time that I don't sound like I'm from the South until I say words like insurance and umbrella, then it like comes out real heavy.
Right.
Um, but hearing my parents speak or even my sister speak and being like, how are you from the same family? I remember when I first moved, I moved from Texas to New York and then to LA, and I've been in LA since. I remember working as an adjunct professor at City University, New York, and we had a lot of students from Long Island. And one of my students saw my Texas tattoo, and she goes, "Professor, you don't have an accent at all." I was like, "Oh, this is curious."
And what's so fascinating about that is it really reveals a lot about the power dynamics behind accent.
Mhm.
Because everybody has an accent. We often don't
Right,
hear our own accents, and typically the people that don't think of themselves as accented or believe in this sort of myth of non-accent are those that are from groups in society that have the most power, and therefore their form of speech, their style of speech, their accent is the norm. And
right.
that way, because they don't deviate from that norm, they think of themselves as having no accent. But if you leave your country of origin and you go to Britain, for example, or Australia, you do have an accent.
Mhm.
So all of us do. And there are also little things in everybody's speech that reveal who they are. And I think one of the things that we haven't done a good job with as linguists is getting the word out that accents are not just about place, they're
Mm,
about anything social about us that leads to fractures in social space. And sometimes that's geography. So if we're divided by mountains or lakes or oceans, that will lead to differences in the way we speak. But a lot of the power of speech changing over time is driven by other types of social distance that forms between us. And that can be, someone that is from a different ethnicity and
yeah.
maybe there's less contact or hostility between different ethnic groups. And so they will sound different, or it can be class, even in the same location. A lot of times we can recognize someone who might have more working class features and more middle class features. Those are all accents too. It's not just about geography.
It's so fascinating to think about because in LA, my exposure is wildly different than it was in North Texas, right? In North Texas, all my friends had shades of something similar, unless they were sort of their parents or they themselves were first or second generation American. But most everybody who was like multi generation living in the South, they kind of sound, there's like a Dallas sound, you know? And I was from the burbs of
Absolutely.
Dallas, but living in LA, it's like, you never know. You don't know where anybody's from. And when somebody's like, "Oh, I'm a native Angelino," you're like, "What? You exist?"
I
That's a
know,
real
yes,
thing.
that in those big cities, right? A lot of times,
Yeah.
especially on the West Coast, because it's a relatively young region, it
Hmm.
does feel like that. Even in Nevada, where I'm from, or I'm not from, but where I live in Reno, it's very surprising to find someone who's actually from here or from here for more than one generation. And, I think that's partially just being Western. It's also this sense of, urban life that's relatively
Hmm.
recent. So, it hasn't been that long that most of us lived in urban centers. That's a relatively recent development in American history, and that radically changes the people we come into contact with. And interaction is really the bread and butter of accent. So it's not necessarily the place you grew up or even the way that your family speaks that will determine the way you sound. It's the people that you interact with the most and that sort of represent this goal or identity that you want to have. And, you mentioned
It's
that you don't sound
fascinating.
like your sister.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
we wondered, how are we from the same family? Well, in earlier research I did with my colleague was at Duke, we looked at the same family that had 10 children. And we ran different types of statistical simulations on their speech. And we do this through, we use instrumental analysis of their vowels. So it's technical. We have numbers that basically go in there that measure their acoustic waveforms. And we
Hmm.
found that, they were no more similar to each other than any other 10 random people.
Oh, wow.
So while they all had Southern accents, so they were more similar to people from the South,
Hmm.
they were not that similar to each other more than some other random Southerner, and that tells us that it's not the people you're born to that really have the biggest impact on your speech, it's the people you hang out with, and so peer groups are really vital in the speech and the accent that we will inhabit in later years.
It's interesting too. One of the things that you mentioned when you were talking about how it's not always, the region, it's not necessarily the family of origin, but all of these other influences that you have. I think if I didn't make a note with my pen, but I think you said something along the lines of like, and who you sort of choose to, maybe you didn't say emulate, but be near or like
Yes.
model.
The
And it's
identity you want to have, the one you want to project, the one that you kind of look to as something that is a style leader for you is essentially
yes.
what we find.
I love it because I had a partner once and he grew up in a region of Jersey and he has, that sort of what lots of people would describe as the non-accent accent or the neutral accent or the whatever, kind of educated, what is it, like mid-Atlantic? I don't even know how,
Right.
and we'll
Yeah.
get
Well,
into
yeah,
that.
New Jersey depends on which side of New Jersey you're on, whether you constitute a mid-Atlantic or more northern accent, but yes.
Well, he did say that when he was growing up, he would say things like woulda and like walk the
Oh, yeah,
dog.
so he had the mid-Atlantic because that's more near the Philly accent.
Yeah, and then he
Mhm.
had to kind of teach himself to not talk like that by choice. Like he chose to do that. Whereas when I was growing up in Texas, from all evidence I have from my folks, from looking at videos and listening to recordings, I always kind of just talked like this. Even though the people around me, well, the people around me did too, I'm sure my peer group did, but my sister and my parents didn't. And so I always was asking myself, did I make a conscious or maybe it was an unconscious choice to lean into certain styles of speech?
Yes, I mean, it's really an interesting question of how conscious it is, but we don't really actively monitor our speech that often, especially when we're young children.
Mhm.
We might when we go into a job interview or even when we're at work, but if we're hanging with our friends at the bar, we're probably not saying, "Oh, how am I going to pronounce this vowel?"
Right.
It just doesn't work that way. And also, it's hard to understand how intricate the system of language is. I don't think generally people understand that when we speak, it's incredibly rule governed. So if I do
Mm.
something with my a vowel in one case, I will do it with the a vowel in every case I say with that vowel, every word that it occurs with typically, unless I
Mhm.
have a very unique dialect region like the Mid Atlantic that actually has some even funkier rules about it. So how would I even know where to put on an accent consciously? I wouldn't. So it's
Right.
probably a subconscious motivation or desire we have to sound like certain people. But this starts very young. So we're probably doing this as soon as we hit kindergarten and get a peer group. And
Mm.
it's called vernacular reorganization when we start to adjust our system towards those around us from that of the home language or dialect or form or style that we grew up with up to about age 5. The other thing I will say is I don't know whether your sister is older or younger than you, but
Older.
she's older. So
Older.
I would
Mhm.
so that's interesting, and we don't have to reveal anybody's ages here, but there has been a really big trend in the South, and I'm of the generation where it started, and it where we find that every generation since has had less and less of the Southern accent in urban
Mhm.
areas in the South. This is not true of the rural areas of the South, but in places like Dallas and Memphis, where
Mm.
I grew up, in Atlanta and Raleigh, massive amounts of northern immigration is one of the big reasons why this is the case, but also just a relocation of many Southerners to those urban areas that kind of orients people there to a different kind of accent that's more external to the South has
Mm, mhm.
reduced the southernness of Southern speakers there. And that's Generation X, where we see the first step on that road to less accent.
Interesting, and I would be considered an elder millennial, while my sister would be a Gen Xer. But also, I think there's some weirdness about where she went to college and then got married and moved to Arkansas and then moved to New Orleans and kind of probably redeveloped some of these quirky Southern styles of speech that I never did that. And it's just so fascinating thinking about the uniqueness. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the variables that are obvious to us versus the ones that fly under the radar. Like there are things I think that we don't even notice about how most people speak, those small variations that just sound generally American or maybe a little more regional. And then
Absolutely.
out of the blue, you have people like my partner now who is from Michigan, who has the most Midwestern, and he says things like milk.
Uh-huh. Yeah, he has something called the Northern City Shift.
And it's so obvious to me.
To be fair, milk is actually also, you can find it in Toronto. So, it's not just Michigan, or Chicago also has that feature. But he also say things like the word J-O-B, more like jab? I got a jab.
I
Or
think he
socks
does.
is more like sacks.
Sacks, and he says pajamas instead of pajamas. Like, that's a big one for me.
Yes, well, that actually you find more widespread, the pajama distribution. But for Southerners, it's pajama. And so when I moved to the West, that was something I noticed a lot of people here say. It feels wrong to say it, but pajamas.
It's so wrong. I know, but it's
that's
only
a good
because,
Southern, right? So if that's this is where your Southernness is there, because that is something that Southerners tend to say. That's, people, we've moved, so it's not only something Southerners say now because we're contagious, but
it also made me laugh when you said Nevada, because anybody from Nevada or lives in Nevada calls it Nevada, but so many people call it Nevada.
If you're east of the Mississippi, you tend to call it Nevada. And in fact, being from the South, I also called it Nevada until I moved to Nevada. And I think within the first day of being here, I was told under no uncertain terms that if I wanted to stay here, I would learn how to correctly pronounce the state name. And it's been so drilled into me now that it hurts to say it the other way.
That's amazing. Do you know, I just love the examples. I have to come up with one that people can tell where I live in 2 seconds if we start to talk about traffic. And it's not even an accent thing, but it is linguistic, in that in Southern California, and apparently only in Southern California, we put the word "the" before the freeway names.
Yes.
We say take the 101, the 2, the 5. And it's just, I didn't even notice that I was doing it. And whenever I'm outside of home, it blows people's minds.
Yes, that is a very typical California trait, Southern California exclusively. So it's sort of like saying hella. That's a northern. If you're from the California area, you know that hella is a northern and the 101 is southern. So it's sort of we call it a shibboleth, something that really automatically identifies where you're from the way you pronounce something. The interesting history behind the 101 pronunciation, or the sticking the in there, I believe it has to do with when it was first constructed, there weren't other options and people would call it the 101. And that just sort of stuck around. It has something to do with its earliest construction history. I can't remember the exact story, but it's quite interesting if you want to dive into that. But yes, it's absolutely a Southern California feature.
It's so, I mean, it reminds me of, and I'm sure you know all about it, I wonder if you worked with it before, that massive project that was, I think, published for like users through the New York Times. It was like use guys and y'all or something, that crazy quiz that would tell you exactly where you grew up.
I think that was by graphics editor. I think his name was Josh Katz, and it was based on the Yale Diversity Project. So it was a professor at Yale's sort of linguistic atlas work, which he had done with his students for many, many years, and compiled a huge amount of data that this graphics editor used to generate those different, word models. Tricky now because that was actually, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while back now.
Our massive connectedness now through social media, boundary crossing, and also our mobility, which has really moved people around and into new areas and into urban areas from rural areas at massive rates this century, has made it so it's much harder to use those kinds of clues to where people are from. But there are certainly big ones. It's hard to pinpoint someone to a little city or something, but there are certainly big ones, like pajama, and pajama is on that, is a good example.
There were a couple that could really pinpoint you, I think, like what do you call a drive-through liquor store? And I was like, oh, it's a beer barn. And all my friends are like, what is that?
If you even have one of those,
yeah, exactly.
right? Yes. I mean, in Tennessee, yes, no drive-through liquor stores. So I remember when I saw that, I was one of the have no idea what the heck you're talking about on that thing. And then I married someone from Ohio, and he was like, "Yeah, obviously,
It's
that's
Beer
where I go
Barn,
get my
duh.
beer all the time."
Yeah.
So yes, as there are certain things that stick around because you don't have them elsewhere, and there's certain ones like water that are very tied
Mhm.
to very specific places. So that's a very typical, well-known Philly trait. So there are
Mhm.
certainly still those that stick around, but a lot of young people in Philadelphia don't say that anymore, although they would still recognize that over someone from California, and someone from LA probably has no idea about that. So it's a really fun survey. The problem with with words being the focus is words are fairly easy to pick up. So there are
Mhm.
sort of superficial measures of differences between us. Now, a lot of those are historically based, and so those have become entrenched in regions in ways that are pretty good determinants. So I don't know if you'd heard of it before, but one I love on that one, which I had heard growing up in the South, is when you have rain on a sunny day. So
I
the rain
remember that
comes.
one, and
Yes.
I had never heard of a sun shower or whatever. I mean, there were other options. I was like, I don't know what that is, but apparently a lot of people do use those words.
Yes, and in the South, and especially rural areas of the South, it's very typical to say the devil's beating his wife.
Oh my God. Yeah, I
That's what
definitely
it's
had not heard of
called, right?
that.
So
Wow.
when the sun is out and it's raining, it's because the devil is beating his wife. And so my students, I
OMG.
do here in Nevada, I always do a regional dialect survey on the first day we start regional dialect talk in class, and that one kills them every time because
Yeah.
they are in disbelief that that
What?
could exist. And really, it's an archaic form. You don't hear it very often anymore, and certainly no one under the age of 50 probably says it, but it is, an authentic difference. But one of the ways that we kind of do new dialect atlas work, and
Mhm.
another survey that's very famous was the phonological atlas done by Bill LeBove and his colleagues at UPenn, is by looking at the way vowels are pronounced across the
Mm.
various regions and how they're similar or different, because those are harder to pick up. So if I move to a new place, I can often pick up a new word or two, and I can actually pick up a new pronunciation in a single word or two. But to do that in a very systemic fashion for all the vowels that that word affects, like picking up the whole pin pen merger pattern, if I
Yes,
move to the South,
yes.
that's almost
Mhm.
impossible. So studying the way that people say their vowels is actually a really good diagnostic of regional
Uh,
sort of upbringing.
yeah, it's probably why milk stands out so much to
Exactly, exactly, and that's
me.
why, one of the traits that is still somewhat present in young Southern speakers, I can hear it, especially young African American speakers that are,
Mhm.
maybe live in the South, is the pin-pen merger. That is actually one that you can still hear a lot of times when people leave the South, you
Yeah, my
still can
sister
hear
has that
traces.
intensely, like, it just
Yes.
sounds like she says, like, "pin," and it sounds like the
Peon, like
same word, "pin."
we
Yeah.
went. Yes, it's
Yeah.
very strong. And so if you're in the South, it's still very strong. But a lot of times Southerners that leave the South, they'll still have it years later. It's sort of hard to change out. But if I'm moving to the South, I could probably start I could learn to say when in that one
Mhm.
word, but I'm not going to know that it also affects words like since and sense.
Right,
And
you'll still
also
hold on
everything.
to
Right.
those. Oh,
Right.
my mother does that. My mother's Puerto Rican and grew up in New York, and when she moved to Texas and had us, and she's been there since, she had I think a New Yorican accent, but now she says words like "owl," like, "I need to get my owl changed."
Right.
And
So
I'm like,
what she's
"What?"
done is she's picked up that Texas. That's a very sort of typical Texas
Uh-huh.
pronunciation. She's picked up certain words with that
Mhm.
vowel in them. But if you actually
Fascinating.
measured her vowels more systemically, so that what we do is we talk to people and we have them speak for an hour, and then we have them read certain things, and then you kind of pull out all occurrences of the same vowel. That's where you can really see what they really sound like, because it's really hard to know as a non-linguist what those rules are if you haven't been born somewhere. And what we also find is if your parents are from that place, that's when you really tend to have a heavier accent. So if you
Mm.
move at 3, you can pick up the accent of the new place you move to because you're still in that formative accent phase. But if you have parents from that place that move back there with you at 3,
Mhm.
you're going to acquire that accent even more.
Yeah, I've noticed that with a lot of folks where you'll think something is regional, but maybe it's not regional, and then you find out that their parents lived, grew up and lived their whole lives in a certain area, and it sort of made its way into their speech. I think an example that I hear a lot, and maybe you can help me with this one because I still don't know if this is regional, generational, or what, but I have friends from Connecticut and friends from Oregon who both say the word both, like both. Like instead of both, they put an L in it. They say both.
Both, like an intrusive L.
Yeah, both.
Yeah,
And
I
I'm like,
know, I have
what is
heard
that?
that feature, and they're from Connecticut. That's interesting.
Connecticut, but
So,
also Oregon.
but that so Oregon, when you get to the western states, that doesn't seem it's never that surprising when you hear features from somewhere else in parts of the
Mm-hmm.
West because of the migratory patterns of
Right.
settlement later. So, the West was settled about 200 years after the East Coast colonies were settled, and it
Right.
was already America, and the accent in the American states was that they were bringing over with them was also already much different from the British forms that many of the earliest settlers had brought over. There was also a lot more other language influence. So you had a lot of Scandinavian, Finnish, German settlement in the upper north that would have gone from Connecticut to usually you migrated westward alongside sort of the parallel of where you had started. So the
Ah, so they're
earliest
both
settlement in that
north.
area was
Yeah.
really New England. Connecticut
Mm-hmm.
was an outpost of the New England colony. So
Mm.
that actually makes sense to me that you could hear a feature. A lot of those are sometimes remnants of either an immigrant language that
Mm-hmm.
affected the pronunciation. So that sounds like a monophthongal vowel. So that means a shorter vowel, which is often sort of Scandinavian. So that's sort of why you get Minnesota. It's a
Mm-hmm.
shorter
Oda.
vowel, and
Yeah.
actually in earlier Englishes, we would have more monophthongal vowels, so around the revolutionary times, we would have said something like "go" or "no," more like "ga," "na."
Oh my
So
gosh.
sometimes those are remnants of those early forms that just got retained in a word or 2.
Oh, that's so fascinating. When you watch like period pieces, does it make you crazy how wrong they are?
So wrong, so wrong. Yes, at one time, I did have a director of a movie that was, sort of set in the early 1800s, the very early 1800s, call to ask for some help in making sure they did authentic dialect, and
Oh, cool.
I'm not an accent coach, it's a very
Right.
different thing, right, to be an accent
Right.
coach than to be a professor of linguistics, but I was like, "Okay, let's give it a try," so I was telling him a lot of the features that would have been frontier speech at the time because this was set in the frontier, and, for most people, if they heard features of frontier speech from that era, it would sound very rustic and hickish to our ears,
Mhm.
because a lot of those things like wrestle and get and Sari for Sarah,
Mhm.
or Bess for best, those things were actually very widespread features in the early colonial period that had become around the Revolutionary era a bit heard as a bit more rustic even then by the more educated elite in the cities along the East Coast, but it was
Yeah.
very much what the frontiersmen spoke. That was considered very
Interesting.
typical of frontier speech. So it would have sounded, really hickish to most modern English speakers. So I did not think that that's probably how he wanted to have his main character speak
Mhm, mhm.
in this piece. But most of the period pieces always seem to think that the elite British RP accent is the one that everybody spoke in the, from 1600 to current times, but
Yeah, and
particularly
apparently
in
in
that
every
period.
country
In
too, for some
every
reason.
country, if you want to seem like have some colonial era
Yeah.
language, it's gonna be RP, but the truth is RP, received pronunciation, this sort of posh British accent we associate it with Queen's English today,
Mhm.
really didn't emerge until the late 18th, early 19th century.
Really?
Yes, so it doesn't mean that there weren't components of it, but 2 of the most recognizable features of received pronunciation, which is non-rhoticity, which is a really fancy word that simply means R dropping.
Mhm.
So saying
Aw,
things like
sis.
"water" instead of
Water.
"water,"
Water.
that didn't emerge until the late 18th century, and
Hmm.
also the "aw" for "a" pronunciation was also not prevalent in even elite British speech until then. In fact, those 2 variants, which was saying things like, instead of saying "aunt," you'd say "aunt," or
Mm-hmm.
even instead of saying father, you'd say father. Those would
Mm-hmm.
have been very typical of all British speakers up to the end of the 1700s.
No
So
way.
none of the representations we give people with that RP accent in those period dramas is very accurate, unless it's
That
after the 1800s.
That's so fascinating. And I see that actually with all of my British, South African, Australian friends. I always tell them they're allowed to call me Cara because they struggle to say Cara, but none of my American friends who are, from here are allowed to do that. I'm like, it's not my
It's
name. It's Cara. It's
it's
not
so
Cara.
tricky. You have a tricky name. So the funny thing is the words spelled with A, and particularly those before an R, are
Mm-hmm.
incredibly variable in the history of
Mm-hmm.
English and American English, particularly. So depending on where you're from, you'll say those vowels differently. So I think we do have to cut people some slack, but I do have a lot of
Exactly.
friends with A names like yours that get, a little bit upset when people seem to use the different vowel. And I get it. I get it. I don't like being called Val. So, we all get to choose what we are called. But
What we're
I will
annoyed
say
about.
in their defense, even for Americans, there are such variable pronunciation for words that are spelled with A, especially if they were borrowed words or from a different language. They
Yeah.
get variably pronounced in American English or Canadian English. So one of the examples, my mother is actually French Canadian, and the word pasta, it used to drive me batty when she pronounced it because it was pasta.
Pasta.
Pasta,
Yeah.
which is a very Canadian pronunciation of the word pasta. And again, it's because it's a loan word and a loan word with with an A in it, and that throughout our history of borrowing words has always been really hard for Americans to settle themselves on one particular pronunciation of it.
Yeah, and I think it also varies by context. I used to always joke that my father, who is Italian but many generations, separated, who gave me my last name. If you say it the way that most people, want to say it romantically, they'll say my name is Cara Santa Maria. But if you want to go super southern and include my middle name, I become Cara Louise, and it's a quick change there, a
But
quick
so
change.
adaptable. I love it.
There's so many interesting things. I remember reading a book when I was young about the Revolutionary. No, it was not. It was about the Civil War, actually. Yes, it was about the Civil War. And there was a soldier, I think in Kentucky, and the way that they wrote, it was like a lot of phonetic writing in the book. And I don't know why this sentence sticks out to me, but the boy was asking his parents, will Kentuck go sickish? And it was the way that they wrote, will Kentucky secede? And
Oh
I
my
remember
gosh.
being so fascinated by this, like, will Kainta Gooseikish? I don't know what the accent was, but that was how they wrote it. And learning more about like Appalachia and about this region of the United States that was so Scottish and not realizing that.
It was very right, Scottish, not and also it had some, Irish and not
Mm-hmm.
only just the Scots and the Irish, but also the Scots-Irish,
Mm.
were very influential in that area. There was also early British influence as well. So a lot of the features that we think of as typical in Appalachian English, so like a
Mm-hmm.
prefixing, so I'm a hunting and a fishing,
Mm-hmm.
those are actually features that were fairly widespread in early British English. So, at the founding of the initial 13 colonies, you would have heard those not just in Appalachia, which actually wasn't a thing at that
Right, right,
time,
right.
but it would have been all over because it was a feature that was used more widespread in British English at the time. But Scots was a variety of English that retained a lot of older features, and they retained it for
Right.
longer, and so that's why we see in Scots-Irish, we see a lot of features that have overlap with earlier British English, but were retained longer in Scots-Irish. But absolutely, the Scots-Irish were incredibly influential in the Appalachian area.
Yeah, I find that when like I've had I used to have a partner who was Scottish, like born and raised in Scotland, and when he was here in the US, when we would watch movies or he would hear the Appalachian accent, he could understand it better than I could. And I found
So
it
fascinating.
fascinating because he didn't really speak. His parents were South African, so that's extra confusing. So he sounded kind of just like vaguely colonial British, like nobody could place him. But
Right.
he could hear a broad Scottish accent really well because that's how he grew up. He was surrounded by it all the time. And there's a certain point when somebody's Scottish accent is too strong where I'm like, are they speaking English? Like, I cannot understand what they're saying at all.
Yes, I've had a lot of people tell me that the English accents they find most difficult to understand is the Scottish one. So if they go to
Mm.
Scotland, it takes them a few days to kind of acclimate to be like, okay, what are you saying? And it's not surprising because in part it was a more conservative English, meaning that it retained features
Mhm.
longer than, even now English has a lot of new features. Scottish English, I mean, every dialect has changed, so there's none that were the same as the 1600s, and it's a myth
Right.
that Appalachian English is, Shakespeare in the holler.
Mhm.
That's not true. Does it retain certain features that are older? Certainly it does, but every accent does things like that. We all have things that are older and younger and new and innovative, and Scottish English is the same way. It's gotten innovations, but for example, in Scottish English, you tend to have more differences in vowels that occur before our sounds than American English, where we've kind of merged everything together.
Mm.
So if you have words like Mary, Mary, and Mary, which are
Mhm.
Merrry, Marry, and Mary. Most Americans merge those suckers. But, in Scottish and Irish Englishes, those vowel mergers before R were not as widespread. So you tend to have
Oh,
more distinct vowels before them. So that's
right. More like
more
marry
archaic.
versus Mary versus,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Oh, that's,
Southerners actually used to do that distinction more often, but
mhm.
it's harder to find it in the South nowadays.
And you hear the opposite. I remember there was a viral video of a man in Baltimore, which to me is one of the most fascinating accents. There's a viral video of him reading the sentence. It was something like oh gosh, Aaron something an iron urn. Aaron earned an iron urn. And he was like, iron, earned, and iron urn. Like all the vowels were the same. And he was like,
Yes.
whoa, do I talk like that?
Yes, but, some people feel I have heard Southerners that also say things that I think non-Southerners, if they're very traditional Southern, often at certain places in the South that have a heavier accent where people go there and say the same thing.
Hmm.
So I've had, someone say, "I'm iron it," which is I'm going to iron it. That's Southern for I'm going to iron it.
Oh,
I
right,
used to
right.
know
Or
when that
like,
would say someone who said that, and it took me a while. I'm like, oh, okay, you're going to iron it. One of my friend's
yeah.
mothers when I was young. So I think it's partially whenever we have accents that are further from what we think of as sort of this national standard, general American model that we're more familiar with, even if we don't speak it ourselves, because we can't help but be familiar with it because our teachers, our broadcasters, every
Hmm.
ad on television tends to have that accent. Then it can be harder for a short time for us to figure it out. We do something really amazing called accent normalization or vowel normalization, where our
Hmm.
brain kind of adjusts with enough input and relatively rapidly to try understanding how this new system fits with our old system. So the more familiar
Mm.
you become with the speaker, the better you do at this.
And it probably makes it just easier to understand people with time.
Well, what we do find is people with really diverse accent exposure. So people that either grow up around a lot of diverse accents, so for example, in LA, or they have more people at work from various places, they tend to
Hmm.
do better with accent normalization because they're just more adaptable. They've had more range, so their brain has learned to process it more quickly.
I have a tendency, I've traveled quite a lot in my life. I've been very lucky because of the work that I do to travel quite a lot. And my friends would tell me that I have a tendency when I come home from a lot of travel to sort of have picked up like affectations and different kind of quirks of speech while I'm away. And then obviously they decay after a few days. But usually when I come home from a place, they're like, oh my God, you're talking like you're from there. That's
You're like
so
a
annoying.
superhero. There are yes, I think all of us are familiar with those types, those superhero types.
Yeah. Oh my God, I didn't even notice
Some
I was doing it. That's
some
awful.
people just pick it up, and there really
Hmm.
is some interesting variability in our ability to do that. So I think a lot of times people or feel like they are not as good as other people in picking up languages or hearing accents. And part of it's exposure and motivation for sure, but it does
Mhm.
seem like certain people are more perceptually able to pick up on these finer distinctions,
Mm.
analyze it cognitively, and produce it. And we see this in people particularly that have a really good musical ability.
I
Now
was
that
gonna
doesn't.
say I was trained as a vocalist, and that's
Oh, there you
probably
go.
why.
There you
Yeah.
go. Right. And so if you
Yeah.
especially if you can hear tone differences
Mhm.
really well, you tend to be very good at picking these very nuanced differences in language up better. So there, we tagged you. We know why you're so
Ah,
good.
or bad, so annoying, I guess I could say. I'm also really curious, you mentioned something before about, oh gosh, what was it? It was a Southern thing where they ran the ironing thing, which was so good. And one of the ones that I saw once on it was either Baltimore or Pittsburgh, which I find Baltimore and Pittsburgh to be the most fascinating accents in the US. But they would say like jeet
Oh,
instead of did you
yes.
eat,
Yes,
right?
running it all
Jeet,
together. I mean, all
eat.
of us do it. So there's, economic ways of speaking, and it's all due to articulatory efficiency. And every
Mm,
one of us does things like that, where we sort of smush a lot of sounds into smaller and smaller syllables when we're talking fast, and it's something very familiar and recoverable from the context. The
mhm,
trick is certain places like Pittsburgh, I know, is one. Also, Philly is also known for that, where there's a lot of smushing that goes on. Sort of, it's become a local joke, right? That you could say
mhm.
"jeet yet," and
Jeet, yeah,
everybody there
yeah.
will know what it is. But all of us say "Did you eat yet? Did you eat it yet?" So
Yeah, or we say
none
I'm
of us,
gonna. We don't say
yeah.
I'm
Or
going to.
as a Southerner, I actually, one tag for me, my husband always says he notices I say it, is I say I'm a doing that.
Yeah, yeah.
Imma eat now. And
Imma
that's
eat now,
same
yeah.
thing, instead of I'm going to eat, or finna, right?
I was
The
gonna bring that one up,
combination,
finna. Yeah,
which
I
is
was
fixing to, right? And
fixing
then
to.
yep, and then it's shortened. So, and we all do this. It's all due to these natural tendencies in speech, which are the things that gave rise to accents in the first
Mhm.
place, which
Oh,
is
okay.
whenever we separate, we're not talking to the same people, we will have these different variations arise that sort of come in different ways, different forms, but all from the same underlying predispositions we have as human language speakers due to articulatory and perceptual efficiencies in the way that our mouths work, in the way that our brains process things. So,
Mm,
a great example is in unstressed syllables, of which English has a lot. Whenever you get an unstressed syllable, for every speaker of every variety of English, it will cause what's known as weakening or lenition by linguists, which
okay.
simply means you reduce the articulatory gestures because it's spoken much more quickly, and which with less articulatory force because it's an unstressed syllable. And so
And so those tend to be the ones that disappear?
they are the ones that either get
Okay.
completely deleted, or you have consonantal changes that happen typically, or even vowel changes. So, a great example is the way that we say water.
Mhm.
So, water is a stressed and unstressed syllable. The first syllable is stressed, the second's unstressed, which means that second syllable is ripe for stuff to happen.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, you can get things where it's whole deletion. So I want some wah wah, right? or
Right, right,
or the way
yeah,
a
yeah.
baby would say it, wah wah. But more
Mhm.
likely, what happens is you do something like change the way the T is pronounced. So you either keep it a T, so wata, which
Yeah.
sounds very right British,
British,
or
yeah.
you say wah, which also
Mhm.
sounds British, but a very different variety of British English, or you say water.
With a D, yeah,
Which is
they
called actually
always
a
say that.
flap, right? Which is a flap. It's not really the same thing as a D, which is actually a
Okay.
more forceful articulation. So a D has more articulatory effort than the
Then
flap,
even
but a
that,
flap is
okay.
like an intermediate sound between a T and a D, where the tongue just slaps against the alveolar ridge really fast and makes a D-like sound.
Mhm.
And notice how those are all basically weakening occurrences occurring in an unstressed syllable. So, but the outcome is different, and the outcome is different because we've been separated by time and land and social space. So,
And
one became British and one became American, and it's mainly because those things developed after we separated and were apart for long periods of time.
It's fascinating. And I've always posited, tell me if this is wrong. I've always posited that the reason that Americans say fillet and British people say fillet is because we are adapting I mean, it's a French word, right? So we're saying it the way we heard the French say it? Or did we change it back from fillet?
Well, I'm more systemically American English speakers tend to have stress patterns that are different than British
Mm.
speakers. So secretary, how do they say it in Britain? So
Oh, they say
secretary,
secretary,
yeah.
secretary, or laboratory. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
right. So they often have a different stress pattern, and so that will
Hmm.
change the way you pronounce, especially the end sounds. And like buffet is the same thing. It's different
Yeah,
in
we say
British
ballet.
English
Yeah, we say
and
ballet, and they say
ballet,
ballet.
right?
Yeah.
So it's part of a larger trend, and part of that is driven by after the revolution, the founding fathers and Noah Webster really wanted to Americanize American English because
Mm,
of its role in of symbolic unity, but
right.
also its role in separating us from our former motherland. And so a lot of stress differences were part of this reform movement that was both in spelling to spell English differently, but also to pronounce words in an American way. And sure, some of it, more recently, depending on the history of a specific word, can be, well, we borrowed it later from French. And so
Hmm.
that's why we have that pronunciation. Certainly you can find that. But more generally, when we see patterns like this, it's often attributable to these earlier points of history where the American language was trying to find its own footing. We got lots of new words, new stress patterns, new spellings, and much of this played a symbolic role in establishing American identity. But it wasn't just arbitrary. In fact, people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Noah Webster, John Adams, even George Washington did play a role in making sure the American language, as they called it, which Noah Webster coined,
Mm,
was a unifying force on a fragile nation because the states were already at war with each other within a few
yeah.
years after the revolution. And having regional dialects was actually something they were worried about. Having different ways of saying things was something they
Wow.
were worried about because of the impact it had in sort of establishing a national identity.
So how did they talk? Like, I've always been curious because I don't trust the movies. I mean, I know that they didn't have just straight up British accents, but even when you look hundreds of years later at early like American cinema, there was this way, or if you listen to old recordings of poets around the turn of this past century, there's this like very like affected way that they talk, and I always have wondered, was that how they actually talked, or were they putting something on for the camera?
No, that's definitely putting something on. In fact, in the
Okay.
in the early in the early 20th century when cinema was getting started, there was something called the transatlantic accent, which was an
Hmm.
affected basically fake accent that was very
Gotcha.
prominent in Hollywood, and it had been taught by, essentially articulation and elocution experts and was particularly taught to actors. It was also taught in East Coast boarding schools, which is why it has, the Katharine Hepburn-esque and,
Mm,
Jackie Onassis and Cary Grant, so it has this, mix of people that were both actors at the time, but also just, FDR, those types of people that were just affluent East Coasters, because that was a put on accent that was considered very elite and posh at the time when that was a model
hilarious.
of a sort of New England model of what we should sound like that
But it
would
was just made up.
it was made up. It was actually constructed by a woman who taught elocution, and it was based on the model of a sort of a New England American and, received pronunciation British accent, kind of hobbled together. But if you go back to the time of the revolution,
Mhm.
it's a completely different sound than we would think of today. In fact, I think the closest thing I could say it sounded kind of like is probably what we would think of as an Irish accent today. Although,
Mm,
again,
okay.
that's changed a lot since the time. But words like fight and life would have been pronounced more like foit, loif.
Mm,
So it
mm,
really, there were a lot of things. The flapping we talked about in water would not have happened yet. So people would have
mm.
said water, water,
Wow.
water,
Water,
because there wouldn't
water,
have been
yeah.
R dropping yet. So there would have
Yeah.
been no R dropping. So, a lot of these things and vowels would have been shorter. So when you say day, it would have been more like de.
Wow.
and
Oh.
when you say go, it would be more like go. So
Oh.
it was very different than what we think of, and it was probably heard as still somewhat British, and it
Mhm.
probably wasn't that different than the British of that contemporary time. There especially on the East Coast colonies that had a lot of contact with Britain, and they would have
Mhm.
had a lot of British speakers because the model of the colonies for really up to the time of the revolution was the model of London for cultural style and speech. So it
Right.
did have a pressure on the colonies' speech, especially among the educated colonists in those cities, to sound more like that. So it would have sounded still somewhat British, but a lot of the commentary we see at the time of people writing notes about how Americans versus British speakers sounded say that the Americans spoke a more pure form, a
Hmm.
more homogeneous, elegant form of British English, and that's probably, indicative of the fact that in Britain at the time, you could walk 10 miles down the road and not understand your neighbor because there
Yeah.
were so many incredibly, rich, diverse accents at the time, both from what part of Britain you were from, but also, and even within England, if you were Northern or Southern English, but even a little town that had its unique accent, and then class was also very prominent. So in England, there were a lot of diverse accents that sort of felt like no one talked the same way and you couldn't understand your neighbor. But because of the fact that it was a London cultural and linguistic model used in the colonies, and the fact that you had people from all over Britain, plus some German and Scots Irish and Welsh. And Dutch settlement early on, you got this sort of leveling of accents so that it kind of moved towards this more central tendency of what was more prominent in these feeder accents that would have made it still sound British, but almost like a purified form of British English, where some of the more regional accent features that were less prominent in everybody's speech would have died out.
Oh, it's so fascinating. There's one concept that I know I said I was gonna keep us at the hour. I'm trying, but there's one concept that I can't help but bring up that I find really fascinating. You've talked a lot about the divisions, right? The divisions, like geographically, the divisions of class, the divisions of country of origin, even through time we've been discussing. One thing that I think is a really fascinating, slice of America is when I talk to my friends, and specifically my Black friends who have kind of cultural accents, but who also feel a lot of pressure in their daily lives to code switch. And their ability, and I think some people have, more or less ability, probably based on all sorts of different things, but their ability to change how they speak depending on the audience and whether obviously the perceptions there are going to be hateful or understanding or communal or judgmental. And it's such a fascinating, I think, example of a lot of things that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. The African American English that we hear around us today, what a lot of people don't understand, and this is why I had to write a whole chapter on it in the book because I felt like this was such an important story that doesn't get
Hmm.
told, is that's a colonial English, just like every
Mm.
other English, and we forget that African American heritage started forcibly, but at the
Yes.
same time, essentially, that the colonies started. So, the first slave ship was brought over, and I think it was 1619, which is actually before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. So,
Hmm.
the history of African American English is just as long as the history as of white English of the
Hmm.
colonies. But what is really, I think the point of what you were talking about is something called the double consciousness of being Black in
Mm.
America, which you have to be able to recognize and adapt to these different situations in terms of how you project your identity because first of all for safety, for
Right.
professional success, but also for in-group membership and feeling part of something. So this idea that you're supposed to sound general American is completely denying the fact that our identity is tied up in the accents that we have in the speech of the people we love and grow up with and who are important to us. But it also ignores that after you can be an African American English speaker and be a middle class standard African American English speaker.
Hmm.
This idea that African American English is only this vernacular form
Right.
is erroneous. And I think what we have found, particularly in the modern era after the Great Migration of the 20th century, that African American English, which effectively was Southern to begin, because at the turn of the 20th century, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. But by the
Right.
end of the 20th century, 50% of those African Americans lived in urban areas, primarily in the North. And many have also re-immigrated into the South since then. But, it is a story of such incredible cultural, linguistic, musical, literary, social heritage that forged all these different varied accents of African American English. And I think what we often think of as code switching is often this idea that to be Black in America and sound Black can serve a really good purpose for you as a social being, right? Fitting
Yes.
with the people that matter to you. But it can also be a very difficult sound to have if you're trying to be successful in the structure that white America has put up.
Right.
And, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that we don't expect most middle class white speakers to go to school or go to work and adopt a different accent, and then get judged for the fact that they can't do it.
Right.
But
Yeah.
that's precisely what we expect African American English speakers to do. And so
And we
I
are
think
less patient about it. I mean, as a like a white nationalistic supremacist society, I think we are less patient with an African American person who maybe has more of a difficulty with that adaptations than somebody who is like a foreign national, right? Somebody from India or somebody from China who speaks English but has a very thick accent.
I don't know, I think that we're impatient with a lot of
Yeah, I think you're
different
probably
groups.
right. I'm
I
like,
think,
it's a pretty racist country across
it
the
is,
board,
and
I
it's not
think.
just race, it's class. So, I
Right,
mean,
right.
I think also we forget with African American English, and this is one point that I really do think is important, is there are a lot of African American standard English speakers. And I'm not talking
Mhm.
about necessarily standard mainstream general American only, but there are standard varieties of African American English that have more of the
Yeah.
prosody, sort of the melody, but less of the, stigmatized features. And that's a different thing than a working class white speaker or Black speaker that tries to be successful in professional America. And
Right, right, right,
I
right.
don't know that race is a big issue for sure, but also class is a big issue. And if you are Black and working class, you have a double whammy. But if you're white and
Mhm.
working class, you're judged also quite a bit for the accent you have. And there's a resounding number of studies that suggest when you talk with a accent that betrays your class status, that sound makes
Mm.
you sound like you're from a certain class group, that doors shut to you in professional settings, but also that people
Interesting.
find you less intelligent, less educated, sloppy, lazy, all these negative personality traits.
Mm.
So I think it's actually a lot with class, and race does also play an issue, but I think also non-native speakers. I've heard from so many non-native speakers that have told me that they've encountered that same kind of impatience.
You're so right.
So I
You're
think,
so
what
right.
we don't understand is that we don't just speak with an accent, we listen with an accent, and
Mhm.
we filter everything we hear through the accent of our own people, right? Our own groups, our own identities, and then we judge other people for not measuring up to the identity accents that we have, and it's really about communication, and we are in a partnership when we're communicating, and we tend to forget that when we're talking to someone that doesn't sound like us.
Absolutely, and I think we see it with gender differences as well. I mean, one thing we were talking about right as we started this recording, and maybe it's an interesting note to go out on, is the judgment that often women speakers have with the sounds of their voices and different standards that are held. I mean, I know working on another podcast where I'm the only woman. We get so many emails all the time about my vocal fry and about how often I interrupt. And the male host is always like, I interrupt more, but
I
nobody ever corrects
100% sure am
me.
sure of it. I'm
Yeah.
100% sure of it. We hear interruptions from women much more than we hear them from men, and
Mhm.
this is a very consistent finding. The vocal fry issue, so this was actually what the topic of my first book. Why one of the main motivations for, like, Literally Dude is because it's not just that these are new features we love to hate, but that so many of the new features that we love to hate are also new features that women are associated with.
Mhm.
And it really is there is a lot of history behind why that's so, dating back to, antiquity. But vocal fry is a particular pariah for a lot of people in the broadcast network. So I hear that from so many female hosts. I can't tell
Mhm.
you. Almost every female host of every interview I have been on tell me that they have gotten notes from listeners about their vocal fry, even though men fry too. And historically speaking, when we look at the early studies of fry, we hear when the studies were first done in Britain, it was a predominantly masculine
Yeah,
feature. It
because
was
men
heard as
have deeper
masculine.
voices. They
Yes, and
they
it was
do
heard
that
as
more.
being actually aristocratic. So,
Mhm.
somehow now that women use it and we notice it more in women's voices only because creak, which is what we call it, but vocal fry happens at lower pitches. So
Yeah.
women have higher pitch voices. So when they go to creak, in order to get creak, you have to drop to a lower pitch. And so it's more noticeable that pitch cliff that you go off
That
for
makes sense,
women.
yeah. And I have a
Um,
deeper voice for a woman. Like, I don't have a high-pitched voice as far as women's voices go, and I
and
do. I creak
And
a
that's a
lot.
pressure on you in broadcast settings. So we
Mhm.
find that actually in the 1990s, one study looked at women in broadcasting and found that women in broadcasting tended to use vocal fry in part to achieve this deeper broadcast
Mm,
voice that was required for women. Because in the 60s and 70s, when we first start seeing women in broadcasting, they were called shrill.
of
And
course.
so there's been a general lowering of pitch in many women's voices, particularly in that setting. And then vocal fry also adopts a lower pitch. And those same women in a later study that used it in broadcast settings did not use it in non broadcast settings. So it seemed to be
Fascinating.
something that what they were using in order to come off as more authoritative and more, sort of assertive in their speech because they were often then getting hit for not sounding assertive enough. And then they
We can't
adopt a
win.
feature. Yeah, you can't win. And all of a sudden we're sounding, too deep.
Oh god. It's so I mean, gosh, I feel like I could talk to you for like hours and hours and hours about this stuff. I warned you at the beginning. I'm fascinated by accents. You are a wealth of information. We didn't even get into most of the things in your book, which is always the case on this show, because why would we do that if you could go buy the book, people? But is there anything, I mean, there's probably several, but is there anything that sticks out to you that we didn't dive into that's sort of like, whoa, that's like such an important topic and we just completely glossed over it?
I think, we talked about a lot of the things that create accents over time, class, ethnicity, separation by geography. But one thing I think is a really interesting topic that I have a couple chapters that touch upon in the book that we don't tend to think of is what drives us to be attracted to certain sounds more than
Mm.
others and certain languages more than others. And so, for example, why is it that we hate the word moist? Or, I can't stand the word panties.
Oh, me
What
neither.
is
That's
it?
the one. I was literally about to say that. It's so gross. Just say underwear.
I know, exactly. It just say underwear. And, there's a lot of semantic associations because especially for women, both of those words have been put in context where it's not kind of used not as a slur, but as an uncomfortable
Yeah.
sexualized term for women. And so we do find women find those words more unappealing. But
Mm.
generally, about 20% of the population doesn't like the word moist. So there has to be something driving it. And it can be partially the semantics. What we call moist is often not attractive, right? Moist wounds are nobody's best idea of a fun Sunday. But part of it's also maybe the sounds of the words themselves. And we
Yeah.
see that also. You were talking about Italian, that your father's Italian, and you have this
Hmm.
beautiful, you mentioned it, and I actually almost brought it up then. You said your name in this a beautiful Italian way, and then you said it in kind of this more, Americanized version
Yeah.
in American English. And what I loved about that, it was really an example of how certain types of languages, sounds, and linguistic structures are heard as more beautiful to us. And
Right.
Italian is a beautiful representation of of a language that has that melodiousness that people
Mhm.
tend to find attractive universally because, no offense to anybody who speaks Italian, but it's not really a globally powerful language.
Right, that's
People
true,
aren't
yeah.
learning Italian because it's going to help them with world trade.
Right, right, right.
They're learning Italian because it's a beautiful language, but what makes it beautiful? And if we actually look at its structure, it's because it has a lot of open syllables.
Mm.
And so, we have a lot of fa la la type syllables that
Mm.
end in a vowel, and it has a quality called sonority that occurs more frequently. And sonority is driven by sounds that are made with a relatively open articulation in the mouth. And that sounds like R and L and M and N, which you can almost just get into the rhythm of me saying those versus t, k,
Mm.
p,
Yeah,
right? Which are not very melodious.
which sound very German.
They do sound very German, and so if you look at
Yeah.
German and English, we actually have less sonority and fewer open syllables than Italian
Mm.
or French or Spanish, which are the languages people tend to say are beautiful.
Love languages,
Yes,
yeah,
the
yeah,
love
yeah,
languages. So
romantic
I
languages.
I do think that's a fun part of how we hear sounds. I mean, it's not the
Mhm.
main driver, so you can have a lot of languages that are quite beautiful from that, dimension that are not heard as beautiful languages because they don't have any global power or because they're associated with a disadvantaged group.
Right,
So,
yeah.
a good example of a language you don't ever see on those lists is Hawaiian, but
Mhm.
Hawaiian's actually a very sonorant
I
language.
was about to say, yeah, there's only a certain number of letters, and it's a lot of "ah," "la."
A lot of
Yeah.
vowels, which are the most sonorant of all sounds, and that's probably because of just the power dynamics and
Mhm.
familiarity. So familiarity is a big driver of what we love. So the more familiar a language, the more we love it, which explains why English, which is a relatively unattractive language by the measure of phonetics, is
Mhm.
a very attractive language to many people, not because it has open syllables and you can sing it well, like Italian or Spanish or French, but because you are familiar with
Yeah,
it.
because you saw a lot of movies in English.
Exactly, right? It is
Yeah.
hard to avoid English in the
Mhm.
world, but Hawaiian is one that maybe many people aren't familiar with. So there's all these different factors, and I love everything to do with the way that we talk and make sounds, and I think that the message of the book is really that we are all coming to this from a different perspective of maybe the accents we have and the things we
Mhm.
say, but what really it should teach us is the universality of the facts of identity and meaning and connection that these accents bring us.
Ugh, I love this so much. I'm so sad that we have to end this episode. I just wanna keep talking to you all day long. Everybody, the book is Why We Talk Funny: The Real Story Behind Our Accents by Dr. Valerie Fridland. Valerie, thank you so much for being here. It was such a joy.
It was. You are a great conversational partner. I enjoyed it a
Oh,
lot.
me too, me too. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.